So let me talk about 3 research pearls. The first one is probably the most important. One of the things that we talked about was the pair research. You recall that was the lab at Princeton that for over 2 decades, almost 3 decades, examined this idea of mind-matter interaction in highly rigorous and scientific ways. But at the end of the day, they didn't get replication of their findings with other labs, and perhaps more importantly, didn't even get to a point where they could conclusively say something was going on. Well, over dinner with the lab's scientific director and manager, one of the things that became clear to me was that something that was largely unstated in the background of their research was that their operators, which is what they called their experimental subjects, their operators that were trying to sort of have an impact on their various research apparatus were divided into really more successful and less successful. And that the more successful people seemed to have something in common. And what they had in common was that they had an ability to sort of get into a state where they were at one with the experimental apparatus. And that in general, it was sort of loosely observed. Now, it's important to note that Pear never collected psychological data. They didn't look at introspective data. They didn't ask people what was going on. So this is anecdotally collected by really the lab manager over the course of time. And the lab manager was a psychologist. And one of the key things about her observations was this idea that people seemed to have more success when they felt a degree of oneness or unity with the experimental apparatus. Now that obviously has huge overtones with the idea of non-symbolic consciousness, as we'll see coming up. Another thing that's kind of emerged from the research is a notion of conditioned space. This is something that William Tiller at Stanford, who again has not had his experiments replicated successfully, is a very big believer in, and he has all sorts of complex physics theories relating to it. But the basic idea is that a space that you work in seems to become conditioned and to allow these effects to show up more than they will in other less conditioned spaces. So if you sort of combine these 2 ideas and you look at the success that the Pear Lab appears to have had in some of their experiments in their space, but that were not able to be replicated at other locations where the space perhaps hadn't been used so extensively for this type of research and thus hadn't been conditioned quite as much. And the same being true of Tiller's space. Tiller's space would be highly conditioned from a lot of experimentation, but the sites that tried to replicate this stuff would not be conditioned. A little bit of a pattern might start to emerge. Now, I want to caution you, these are unproven concepts. I'm drawing inferences across different experimental areas. Tiller's area, Pear's area, and some other labs that have postulated the same ideas. And I'm doing the same thing for the at-one type idea, being at one with the apparatus. But I have to tell you that when I run across people doing these types of experiments and I ask their experimental subjects anecdotally what they were experiencing during their more successful runs, this at-one idea has proven itself out. Now again, that's anecdotal. A good example of this was I was out at IONS in Petaluma, California, visiting Dean Radin, who's one of the top scientists in this area. And Dean was running a new experiment using the double slit experiment from quantum mechanics. And we don't have time to go into that, but it's a very foundational experiment, very well known, very, very well documented, incredible experiment. He was trying to get people to sort of, with mind-matter interaction, to change the outcome of that experiment, which is a very, established outcome. And it just so happened that on the day that I was visiting him, he was running some trials with a lady, and this lady had run a whole bunch of different trials of this, and she'd done it in all kinds of different ways, and there were I don't remember, one or a handful that seemed to be more successful than others. And she was sitting there, so I just said, hey, what did you do during those that was different than other ones? And she talked about this oneness idea, that she became one with the apparatus on that trial or those handful of trials. Again, I don't remember if it was one or more than one. And so that's the type of anecdotal research that I'm talking about, just sort of being in the right place at the right time and asking. Or asking researchers that maybe have also sort of asked for introspective information, even though they didn't document it in their papers. Now, the third one is the idea that different strokes apply in different situations. Different techniques are best in different situations. And we saw this, I think, if you remember back to the UCLA studies, where they looked at the idea of what type of mental rehearsal is best. So is it best to sort of have a process-oriented or an outcome-oriented visualization? And it certainly appeared that in some of their research, without question, the process type of visualization worked far, far better than outcome. However, there was at least one study where outcome was also significant. And so things like that, research like that, can be used really to support the idea that different types of visualization, different types of release, different types of emotionality are relevant in different situations. Those particular research designs looked at very different situations. One looked at test scores, another one looked more at sort of managing stress. So there are pearls that emerge, often hidden and often unpublished, as with the at-one type idea, the first bullet point here, which is perhaps the most important of all of these. But there are pearls that emerge from the scientific research.